Hello, NASCAR fans. Welcome to our weekly on pit road NASCAR Hangout Race Rewind. This time for the AAA 400 at Dover International Speedway, the Monster Mile, Dover Downs, whatever word you want to use for that great 1 mile concrete high bank racetrack over in the East Coast. Jeff Gordon won the race, and we're going to talk about that. And I'm Charlie Turner, and I'm joined by my partner in this endeavor, Dan Beaver, down in Texas. How you doing, Dan?
I'm doing great as usual.
Yeah, good. We were talking just for a brief moment before we started this broadcast today about the race. You know, if there were any points we really felt like we needed to bring up, but you and I were both kind of in agreement. This was not the most exciting Dover race we've ever seen.
It wasn't, and I think we all expected a little more desperation out of those chase drivers that would ratchet up the intensity level, and it just didn't happen. But Dover can happen, that it can fall into those long periods of green flag. You just almost never see them at the end of the race, and or recently anyway, and that was the lasting impression. They went green, nearly 150 laps at the end. Got the numbers in front of me.
Yeah, and that was the part that surprised me. I expected to see, 10-lap segments before restarts for the last 100 laps of that race, and we just did not get that. And that's probably why this race seems, less dramatic than it could have been.
And you usually get that at Dover, but you usually get it in the middle stages. So we've made this comment a couple of times about a few races. A great finish can wipe out a mediocre race. In this case, we got that kind of mediocrity towards the end where the action was concerned. Jeff Gordon fans certainly wouldn't agree, but that's what Jeff Gordon needed in order to win the race. Same thing happened to him back in Kansas earlier. If he gets those long green flag runs at the end, he's prone to set his car up for long runs, and that's played into his hands a few times.
Yeah, that really is the case. But on the flip side of that, sort of, is the Kevin Harvick story. Excuse me. I think in one of the NASCAR shows that was on some network last night, I saw a scroll across the bottom. Couldn't hear the audio, but something about Harvick is in his last 6 or 7 races where he has led the most laps, he has failed to win. Now, a lot of those races he's finished second, or at least top 5. So it's not like he's been unsuccessful, but is this getting in his head, you think? Because the problem with that, for me, just observing Harvick from afar for several years, this frustration can get in his head, and he may do something irrational to end that streak.
Well, he's commented that he'd much rather get those consistent top 5 finishes.
Yeah, but I don't believe him. I really don't believe him when he says, I know I've heard that too. Do you believe him?
I believe him for the next round. By the time we get to the eliminator round, I'll probably stop believing him. At that point, top 10s are not going to do it. Top 5s are going to be necessary, and I think the sense of desperation probably will go up. Right now, I think he realizes what it's doing for him in the points, and he realizes how it's getting him to advance, and he sees what's happening with his teammates. Kurt Busch had a bad 3-race chase here. Tony Stewart's been fairly uneven for obvious reasons. And Danica Patrick is uneven because she's only in her second full year. So he sees what the inconsistency does to those guys, and I think that has changed his perspective somewhat. But you're right. By the time we get past Talladega, I think that sense of desperation is going to go way up. And then he could do something to knock him out of that round.
Well, you've commented throughout the year that Harvick's been one of the drivers you almost have to pick almost every week, depending on where we are. But I would say at least 80% of the races we've gone to since the beginning of the season, he's been the fastest car, or one of the 2 or 3 fastest cars in practice and qualifying, those kinds of things. So he's an obvious pick to possibly win, but you've always had this caveat, if they don't screw up, quote unquote, air quotes, if their team doesn't screw up. This time, it didn't look to me, this time it was a flat tire, a left front flat at Dover, which seemed a bit odd, that caused them to finish I think, what was it, 13th instead of, yeah, 13th instead of running up front where he had been most of the day. Did you see any culpability for the team there, or is it that just racing luck kind of thing?
Well, the fact that it happened in both Dover races, it appears that a lug nut went into the tire and knocked the valve stem off in both races. It's odd that it would happen at Dover and no other place.
Yeah.
Maybe it has something to do with the banking and how those lug nuts are getting stuck in there and not flung out immediately if you get up on that banking. But the fact that it happened twice on the same track means that something happened, and they failed to learn what happened in the first race to keep it from happening in the second race. In the spring race, it may have just seemed like it was one of those weird things that isn't likely to repeat. Now that it's repeated, they may look a little closer and see what they could do to keep that from happening again. But for the and it kind of doesn't matter whether or not it's bad luck or a pit crew mistake or a driver mistake or an accident. Something tends to knock them back. You can get away with 2 strong runs and 1 mediocre one at this stage. You're not going to be able to do that in the next couple of stages of the chase. With the caveat that Talladega is going to be the elimination race, and nobody knows what's going to happen. What the impact of the first 2 races will be there. So I think Harvick tends to be a risky proposition just because something's going to happen and you're not sure what it is.
Okay, well, Harvick finished 12th. I want to run down the top 10 real quick just so that if people have forgotten or maybe didn't watch the race, they'll know where we were. Jeff Gordon, of course, won the race, dominated at least the second half of it. Brad Keselowski second, Jimmy Johnson third, Joey Logano fourth. I'd say those 4 guys are the favorites for the Final Four in most everybody's book. We'll see what happens with that. Matt Kenseth was a strong 5th. Kyle Larson, another top 10 for Larson, and he ran top 5 most of at least the second half of the race. He still looks like he's looming to win a race. Martin Truex Jr., good finish for that 78 team in 7th. Ryan Newman 8th, solid. Clint Boyer 9th, solid. And a good finish for Kyle Busch in 10th. Any surprises there for you in the top 10?
Martin Truex Jr. might be a little bit of a surprise just because the communication's been lacking for so long in that team. It is his home track, and he should. Under other circumstances, we probably would have at least talked about him as being a dark horse before the race started. But because that team has had some communication issues or bad luck or whatever, it seems to be communication. Wouldn't have expected them to get the top 10, but it certainly was pleasant that they did. Clint Boyer is another driver who shouldn't have been a surprise, but maybe was a little bit based on what he's been doing in the recent races this season. But I think he had a 7-race top 10 streak going, so he expanded that to 8 races. Dover certainly seems to be his kind of track, but I didn't know that was going to make a difference given the inconsistency at Michael Waltrip Racing all season and what have you. But along with Michael Waltrip himself apparently advancing to the next level of Dancing with the Stars, they apparently had a good week.
Yeah, the thing, I think maybe the story, Jeff Gordon winning is a big story for sure. But I think the story for me about this race is this new chase format. We really don't know what to expect. We think we do. I mean, we talk about this stuff, more than normal humans do. And we expected to see some effect by this being the last qualifier for the next round of this new chase format. And I didn't see it. I looked for it. I kept looking for somebody to be doing something that they wouldn't normally be doing. And I didn't see it. Did you see anything that made you feel like this was anything other than a Dover chase race?
I think so, a little bit. I think we saw it in what was going on with Casey Kane and Kurt Busch. That battle for the final transfer spot, or was for the longest time until Kurt Busch fell back far enough, was probably impacted the way they did everything. A driver wants to make up, if he loses a lap, especially if it's not his fault, he wants to make up all the ground that he possibly can. So you can't say that Casey Kane wouldn't have done that some other time in some other circumstance. But the fact that that it was either the end of his season or the beginning of the next little mini chase certainly seemed to change what they were doing. So I think we saw it there with Kurt Busch. He thought he could pull a rabbit out of the hat, and it looked like he might for a while, but the team simply has not performed up to playoff standards. So it wasn't a surprise that they fell out, but was a little bit of surprise that they made it as close as they did. So I think we saw a little something there. I think we've also seen a bit of an arc to the chase, and we'll see it again in the eliminator round, but we probably won't see it in this round because of Talladega. The arc's going to be much shorter than it was. Drivers, in essence, have 2 races to punch their ticket to the next round. They want to at least win if they can, and if they can't, get enough points that they've got some of the stress off their shoulder at Talladega in case the big one erupts. So they've only got 2 races to do it in this round versus 3 races in the Challenger round or 3 races in the Eliminator round. And I think that's going to make a difference. Good news is that coming up, and we're supposed to be looking backward, I know, and not looking forward, but they are going to be able to control their own fate in this race. Dover, they got a chance to control their own fate. And for that reason, I think we didn't see surprises. We saw the 4 drivers fall off the bottom who probably have had the worst chase to date. Kurt Busch, Brad Biffle, Eric Almirola, AJ Allmendinger. I hate to say they deserved to fall out, but they all pretty much did deserve to fall out. They did not run well enough to advance to the next round.
Right.
And that's what I think NASCAR wanted. They wanted something that is going to reward wins, but also reward strength. And in this case, this first round of playoffs, it did.
Yeah, as we wind this thing up, the one thing that struck me at the end of the race, the post-race interviews with those drivers that didn't make it, I was really taken by how hard they took not making that next move. I mean, the interviews with Almirola had to know after his car went down in the first chase race that he was probably not going to make it. A.J. Allmendinger probably had, although he looked good for a race and a half in this first 3, looked good, but had to know the odds were against him. Those guys looked devastated. They looked like they'd lost their mothers at the end of that race. And so again, that to me, it makes me think that NASCAR's really hit on a formula that at least creates a lot of drama in these last 10 races.
Yeah, and if you thought that was devastating, wait till they're standing next to the smoking pile of wreckage at Talladega and wondering what then.
I predicted on those top 4 guys that finished in this race, the top 4, the 2 Hendricks drivers, Gordon and Johnson, and the 2 Penske drivers, Keselowski and Logano. I predicted today on Facebook one of those guys is going to get taken out at Talladega. One of them. I believe that's true. I just believe that somebody that should be in that final 4 is going down in this last race, and maybe NASCAR will listen to you and take that plate track out of the chase. We'll see.
If they're going to have it, in the chase, it needs to be way in the front. It needs to be the first race of the chase or something, so that the drivers have a chance to overcome it. It certainly shouldn't be an elimination race. But
I agree with you. Okay. Well, he's Dan Beaver. I'm Charlie Turner. Follow Dan on Twitter at Fantasy Race, me on Twitter at On Pit Row. Join us next week when we talk about the big race at Kansas. It's I believe it's the Hollywood Casino 400, I think, this time at Kansas. Similarly configured 1.5-mile track, as Dan likes to say, and we'll talk about that next week in the first round of the contender round of the chase. So thanks for joining us, and we'll be back next week. Dan, talk to you soon.